for this year. It gives me, well, first of all, I need to thank the University Lecture Series and all of the various contributors to the ISU Bioethics program for making this series and Professor LaFollette's visit tonight possible. I'm very pleased tonight to introduce Hugh LaFollette, Professor of Philosophy at East Tennessee State University, whose published work covers an enormous range of topics from ethical theory to policy evaluation to the philosophy of humor. I myself first encountered Professor LaFollette's work as an undergraduate at Oberlin College, so I hold him importantly responsible for my own career in philosophy. Importantly to blame, I suppose, is the way I should put this. Professor LaFollette's work shows that it's possible for philosophical work to be both rigorous and articulate, while at the same time being eloquent and important and moving. And I'm very pleased to introduce him to you tonight. So let me call your attention to the books that are being sold on your way in. World Hunger and Morality is a wonderful collection that would be especially relevant to this audience. So, Professor LaFollette.
I appreciate the opportunity to visit and talk with you, though I'll confess it seems a bit odd for a philosopher from East Tennessee to come to Iowa to talk about issues of food and hunger and farming. Indeed, I expect that on some of these issues you probably know a great deal more about them than I do. You can correct me along the way if there's additional insight and information. Maybe I can. What I'm going to try to do is, Clark said we'd like to hold this for 45 minutes, so I'll do my best. If I get totally out of hand, Clark will yell at me. I'll go on too long. Can you hear me okay? Or do I need to use the mic? You okay? All the way back? All right. If I start to drop too much, let me know and I'll speak up or resort to the mic. All right, what I'm going to do is I want to talk about world hunger. I want to talk a little bit about the causes of world hunger, and then try to place the issues, the philosophical and ethical issues, in a context within which I think they can be best understood. And to begin, I want to just give a sense of the nature of the conditions that we're talking about when we're talking about world hunger. That 1.2 billion people live on $1 a day PPP. PPP is purchasing power parity, which is not the same as actually having $1 American dollar. It's having the equivalent of what $1 American dollar will allow you to buy here, which means, in fact, and I've been very accounts here, it's actually about 67 cents a day. So that 1.2 billion people live on that amount of money, and 46% of the world live on $2 a day. And that, by best estimates, 18 million people a year will die of poverty-related diseases. Now, in contrast to the problems of poverty and hunger, you get a sense of the nature of wealth. And I think this figure is incredibly fascinating, that the richest 3 people in the world have more wealth than the populations of all the least developed countries in the world. That's 600 million people, or 12% of the world's population. So 3 people have as much wealth as the poorest 12% of the world's population. And second thing that's interesting here is that the gap between rich and poor has in fact been increasing over the past decade. And the gap between rich and poor between countries is greater than the gap between rich and poor within the most inequitable country in the world, which is considered to be Brazil. And that itself I also find fascinating. Now, when I say the problem has gotten worse, when you actually look at the figures of starvation, it appears that the number of people who are starving in the world has actually declined. But that is potentially misleading because most of that change occurs because of China, which has had remarkable success in reducing the amount of poverty and hunger. If you remove the Chinese figure. In fact, there are now 28 million new starving people in the world that did not exist 10 years ago, or were not before. Now, when people think about the moral options, how they ought to think about hunger, starvation, and what they ought to do, there are primarily three positions that come up, and I want to just briefly summarize each of them and talk about them. The first position is the charity position, and some variation of the charity position is the position which I think most Americans at least hold. I'm not sure that most Westerners hold, but most Americans do. And it says that feeding the starving of the world is something that would be very nice of us to do, it would be very generous of us to do, it would be very good of us to do, perhaps we'd be noble for doing it, but it's not something that we're morally required to do. If we fail to do it, we've not done anything immoral. The second option says that we have a duty to assist, that it's not just a matter of charity, that we are positively obligated to assist those who are starving. And sometimes that's word in the language of rights, that people have a right to food, and that right puts upon us an obligation to help feed them. And on this view, we are acting immorally if we do not feed them or assist them. And the third option might be a surprising to you, but I wouldn't think so in this audience, that we have a duty not to assist those people who are hungry in the world. That it's not a matter of charity. We're not being generous if we feed people. It's not that we're obligated to feed people. We are obligated to not feed the people who are starving in the world, and if we do, we're doing something wrong. Now, what's common to all three is that most of them frame the moral question in more or less the same way. If we look around the world, we see a substantial amount of starvation, and the question is, what should I, either individually or collectively in the country, do to alleviate that starvation? Now, I want to say a little bit more about each of these three positions. The charity position really has two different forms. And the disagreement here is about what is voluntary. The first view says giving at all is voluntary, and that sometimes is known as libertarianism. According to libertarianism, we have no obligation at all to give any sort of charity to someone in need, though of course we can do so if we want to. The second position, though, says no, we do have obligations to help people in need, but the difference is we can choose who it is that we want to help. So I should not be stingy, I should be generous, I should be willing to give financial goods and time to the assistance of others, but it's up to me to choose to whom I should give that assistance. So what's common on both views is that a person who fails to give to alleviate world starvation is not necessarily doing anything wrong. On the libertarian view, they're not doing anything wrong because they don't have any obligation at all to help others. And even on the second view, the idea of imperfect duties, they're not necessarily doing anything wrong, as long as they are being generous in other ways. So, for example, if I give to the United Way and to the March of Dimes, then I discharge my duty of generosity and I needn't necessarily give to Oxfam or any organization helping to alleviate hunger around the world. So, what I want to do for the purpose of this discussion is, since it is the most common view, I'm going to assume that the charity position is true unless we can show that one of the other positions is wrong. I'll take it as the default position, and then we'll look at more detail at the other two options. Now, what about the idea that we have a duty not to assist others? Some people might find this a bit odd, but the idea is traceable in some degree, or in large degree, to the works of the biologist Garrett Hardin. What does Hardin do? Well, what he says is that we have a limited ability to help others. And he introduces and talks about the notion of the land clearing act. And the idea he has, for example, is you can think about, in fact, I think you probably will look this up, that grizzly bears only so many, a grizzly bear has to have so many square miles of land in order to try to feed itself. 145, let's say, square miles. And as long as you don't have more grizzly bears than one at 145 square mile radius, if that's the figure, I'm just making it up, then you're fine. But if suddenly you have two grizzly bears in that area, then they're not going to be able to feed themselves, and either one of them's going to kill the other one off, or one or the other
die of starvation. Now, Hardin tries to use this idea to explain why we have an obligation not to assist others. At the time of his writing, for example, the population growth rate in India was 2.6%, and in Colombia, Ecuador, and Pakistan, it was 3%. That meant that the populations of those countries would double either every 27 years in the first case, or every 24 years in the next last case. And what he says is this: look, if we feed people who are starving, then what we're going to do is increase the number of people who will survive. If we increase the number of people who survive, we're going to be increasing the population growth rate at this very high level. And although we might be able to feed them now, we will not be able to feed them forever. And once we reach a stage where we can no longer feed them, there'll be a lot more of them, and therefore more of them will die. So the best thing for us to do is to not feed them at all. Even though it sounds hard-hearted, as Joseph Lester, the theologian, put it, this idea shows just how wrong generosity can be. Now, the last idea I want to talk about briefly is the idea that we have a duty to aid those who are starving. And this is going to be come in one of two forms, as I mentioned earlier. One is worded primarily in the idea of duty or obligation, which is found in the works of Peter Singer, amongst, especially his essay called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And the second is in language of rights, that people again have a right to be fed. For instance, if you look at various UN Charter and various UN declarations. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to ignore this difference. Because if one holds that people have a right to food, and if that notion of right is very rich, it still assumes that those of us who are in a position to help them have a duty or an obligation to help them. So what's common to both is a duty or an obligation to assist. That's the way I'm going to frame the question, at least for the rest of the day. Now, what's common about, what's crucial about this view is that it, of course, is going to reject both the charity view, which I first introduced, and the neo-Malthusian view as embodied by Pierre Hardin. Now, how is it going to do that? How is it going to reject the Hardin's view? It seems to me that you basically got two choices. One is that you can claim that Hardin's arguments, though true, are morally irrelevant, or you can claim that he's simply wrong about the facts. Now, what about the first option? I mean, this is not one that very many people take, but I do think it's worth at least mentioning. On this view, Hardin's views would be irrelevant, even if true. Okay? On this view that we have a strong obligation to assist others, and that obligation is so strong that we should be willing to assist them, even if we ourselves become malnourished. And if you want to talk about this idea a little bit more in the question and answer period, I'll be glad to expand on it a wee bit. But the fact is, most people think that if he were right about the figures, if he were right about his predictions, then he's also right about the moral conclusions that we should help. The Singer, I mentioned a moment ago, who's probably the primary advocate of the duty to aid, he says just that. If he's right, then we shouldn't be assisting people. Now, the second option is to say he's simply mistaken about the causes of hunger, the nature of hunger, and he's mistaken about his predictions. Now, at that point, I actually wanted to introduce a fourth option. It is not historically part of the triad of options to think about hunger. What's sometimes called a developmental alternative, which is perhaps most identifiable to Amartya Sen. And it, in a sense, is going to reframe the moral questions in important ways. What's common to most of those views is the causes of hunger is typically the absence or the lack of food. That's why people are starving. For instance, if you think about the Hardin's notion of the carrying capacity, what does it imply? What the problem is? You get too many people and not enough food, they can't feed themselves. That's why they're starving. Or another way it comes out is people talk about hunger as occurring when there is some sort of natural catastrophe, a flood or a drought or a hurricane or a typhoon. And then the question is, what, if anything, should we do? Now, Sen and others have said this is a mistake. It's a mistake because it assumes that the question of whether people can feed themselves is somehow separate from other larger questions about social, political, and economic factors. And he wants to say we need to look at these other factors if we're going to understand the causes of starvation and understand what we can do about it. Think about it for a moment. A farmer's ability to feed himself or herself depends on more than just hard work, rain, and arable land. Okay, you can have the hardest working farmer in the world, you can have the greatest land in the world, you can have plenty of rain, but what happens, for example, if you're living in an area where you have to irrigate and the people upstream dam up your water, right? Naturally you got enough water, but now you don't because of the actions of people upstream. Or what happens if you're in an area where you've got a lot of cattle and they overgraze the land and you can no longer grow your crops? Or what happens if you need seed and other supply to grow your crops, but no one will sell them to you? Or what happens if you don't have enough money to buy the seed to plant your crops? And finally, will people buy your products at a fair price? If these things are not true, then even if you work hard, even if you've got adequate rain, even if you've got good land, you may well not be able to feed yourself. So the claim of the developmental alternatives theorist is if you want to understand hunger, you've got to look at hunger and poverty in the larger context of social, political, and economic order. Now, if they're right, and it seems to me that it's pretty clear there's something right about developmental alternatives, this is going to reshape the moral question. It's not going to get rid of it, but it is going to reshape it. It recognizes that availability of food is one factor that can lead to starvation, but it's one and only one. But whether the decline in food will lead to starvation will depend on any of the other social and economic and political factors. For instance, one of the things that got Sam to realize this, if you get this way, is when he looked at India, areas of India during some of the worst famines, what he discovered was that some of the areas in which the highest starvation occurred happened to also be areas in which they had the highest productivity of food at that time. The problem was the people who lived there simply didn't have the money and the wherewithal to obtain the food. Okay. So the moral implication of this is to reframe the question, right, to eliminate it. We got to ask now, should we ensure that everyone has adequate food entitlements? Should we encourage or coerce our governments to provide food entitlements, to provide food if they do not have it their own? Should we, for example, establish certain trade relationships with these people that would allow them to better feed themselves? What this does, it seems to me, is it undercuts the simple-minded view forwarded by Hardman. Now, there may be a more sophisticated view of Hardman we'll talk about, but at least the simple version, I think, has to go. Why? The fact is the Earth natural catastrophes do constrain our ability to feed people. Okay? The number of people we have will certainly affect our ability to feed people, but not in the direct sort of way he supposes. One of the ways of seeing this is to simply understand that in our world, so much of what we do is based upon our ability to trade with others. For instance, 1/4 of the entire world's gross national product comes in exchange from other countries. And so without that exchange, countries that are now wealthy simply might not be able to feed themselves. I think Japan would be a perfectly good example. I'm not sure that Japan could survive on its own without trade relationships. What makes Japan able to feed themselves is not that they have the best land in the world, but they got a lot of money. People are willing to sell food for it. Okay? And in fact, in the case of Europe, if you look at Europe as a whole, 1/3 of the gross national product comes in exchange with other countries. Now, the second thing that we begin to notice is his predictions about population growth and populations at certain times were just mistaken. He said, for example, that by the turn of the century there would be 6.6 billion people, when in fact there were 5.8 billion people. Now, that's still an awful lot of people, but it's a considerable difference in what he had anticipated. And indeed, when you begin to look at specific countries that he talked about, India, he said at the time, had a 2.6 population growth rate. They were, at the year 2000, they were already at 2%, and the projection would be that by 2015 they would be at 1.2%. So all of a sudden, this country that was no longer going to be able to feed itself, and in fact is going to add to the number of people who are starving, does not appear to be true. So then the question is, what happened? Why did Hardman make these sorts of mistakes? And I think the answer is found in a sociological theory that's been around actually since before the time that Hardman did his work. demographic transition period. And it's gone through various transitions and accounts, but on most accounts what you see is that population change eventually goes through four stages, distinct stages. The first stage is that you have and think back in ancient history, you had steady populations. Now how did you have steady populations? Well, you had a very high birth rate and you also had a very high death rate. And the two cancel each other out. I mean, the population in this world did not grow very much until the past 300 or 400 years. The second stage, all of a sudden, though, you begin to see an increasing population. What explains the increasing population is that birth rates are staying at the same levels or almost the same levels that they were before, but death rates begin to decline. So population growth rate begins to increase. The third stage, and the stage that's probably true of much of the world right now, is that birth rates, in fact, are declining faster than death rates, and so the rate of population is still growing, but not in the rate like before. So, for example, India was at 2.6, now it's at 2, predicted to be 1.2. And the fourth stage, which is the stage which the U.S. is very close to reach, Europe has already reached but surpassed, is steady population again. Why? Because you have both low death rates and low birth rates. Now, as it turns out, the demographic transition theory, it seems to me, is both theoretically plausible and empirically substantiated. Now, why do I say this? Well, think about it for a moment. When I say it's theoretically plausible, all you have to do is go back and think about the history of America 50, 60 years ago. In fact, I was going to watch a picture of my dad's family, and there were 9 of them that survived, and there were 3 of them that died. There were 12 of them in the family. And my dad grew up just over the border in Illinois, western Illinois. Now, why did they have large families? Okay? They lived on a farm. You had a need for people to work the farm. There's 2 ways to get people to work the farm. One is you can pay them, and the second is you can produce them. A lot cheaper to produce them, especially in those days. There was an economic advantage to having children, and there was no real economic drain in having large families. I mean, what was the cost of having large families? You had to feed it, well, you're growing your own food. Okay? Clothes were often hand-me-downs. You didn't send them off to summer camp. You didn't give them trumpet lessons. You weren't expected to send them off to college. The cost of having children was very little. The economic benefit of having children was substantial. What other reasons would you have? Well, if you go back to those days, the days which my dad grew up, there was no Social Security, at least no formal Social Security. There was Social Security, and what was it? It was surviving kids. So what you wanted to do is you wanted to make sure that you had some children who survived you once you reached the age of 65, kids who could take care of you. So you have, and lastly, and perhaps in some ways most importantly, infant mortality rates. Why does infant mortality rate matter? Well, if you want to have kids, you want to have surviving kids. And if you happen to live in an area or a time in which you would expect some number of your children to die from natural causes, then the only way to ensure that you have an adequate number of surviving kids is to have a lot of them. You know, in my neck of the woods, I'm sure this is like there's a place here where I live called Cades Cove. It's an old frontier area. And you can go in the graveyard, and what you see is just tombstone after tombstone. 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, 4 days, 3 hours. All the same name, all the same family. In those days, right, kids just died right and left. So what did they have to do to make sure they had an adequate number of children? So they produced as fast as they could. Now, if you understand that happened here, it also happens elsewhere in the world. If you happen to live in a part of the world which is primarily rural, if you happen to live in a part of the world where there's no Social Security, if you happen to live in a part of the world where there's no formal educational requirements, then you're going to have an incentive to have large families. Now, conversely, what happens when you're well off? For instance, the United States. Look at the family size in the United States. Okay, I typically will ask my class, how many of you plan to have 3 or more children? And it's rare that I have only one person in class raise their hand. Okay? And there are a few who didn't. But now I ask people why. Well, they say, well, I don't want anyone to do, I want one. But you begin at the bottom of it, and the answer pretty clearly is, it's too expensive to have AI. Some years ago, I saw a prediction by futurists that if you were starting to have children, about 7 years ago, if you were going to have a child in that year, plan to spend $280,000. Right? No college, no frills, just basic health care, shelter, clothing. 280 grand. I mean, how many of us can afford 9 kids? And the answer is not very many. So what happens is, depending upon the social environment in which you live, the social, political, and economic environment in which you live, you can have an incentive to have very large families or incentive to have very small families. Now, as it turns out, this theoretical prediction is verified by the empirical data. For instance, when you look at something like the Human Development Report, which gives you kind of the world, what you will discover, and it breaks it into the lowest developed, medium developed, and the highest developed, look at the population growth rates. In the lowest developed countries, the population growth rates are 1.9%, the medium they're 1.6, and the highest they're 0.6. The better off the country is, the more social services they have, the better health care they have, the lower infant mortality rate they have, the fewer kids they have, and therefore the lower growth rate that they have. In short, if this is right, and it seems to me it is, then Hardin's projections, his proposal of not feeding people, will actually make matters worse. Why would it make matters worse? Well, if nothing else, infant mortality rates shoot up. And when mortality rates shoot up, you have an even greater incentive to have larger families. Now, I say that and I want to make the following modification on it. It's only partly wrong. That is, if what you do is you give just enough aid to keep them alive, but not enough aid to help them to really start to grow, you may, in fact, have a worse problem some years down the road. And indeed, I think we have a good example of that when we look at Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has plummeted in the past few years, and I think it's precisely because the amount of aid and assistance that we provided to Sub-Saharan Africa has dropped by a third. So, it's not just that his prediction is quite wrong, it's wrong if we only do, pardon my French, a half-assed effort to solve the problem. Now, the next option is, I'll talk about in some depth, is the idea of a strong duty to help. Okay. I'm going to have to pick up the pace here a little bit. So some of this stuff I'm going to glide through, you can ask me about later. The idea of strong duty to help is sometimes worded in terms of the need to help the vulnerable. And if we think about, when we look at the fact that 2/3 of the people in the world who die from hunger-related diseases are children under the age of 5, these are going to be paradigms of people who are not at all responsible for their conditions and their health vulnerable. And some people have wanted to say it's the mere fact that we have someone who's very vulnerable and we are able to help gives us an obligation to assist them. And children, again, would be the clearest example of this. Now, part of what underlies this idea is actually a quote that I like from John Dewey. It is of grace and not of ourselves that we live civilized lives. Okay? Why is it that we're able to feed ourselves? Why is it we're able to have the sorts of lives that we have? Did I create the world which allows us to have buildings like this? No. The reason I can have and you can have and we can have a decent life is because of things that our ancestors did. We inherited an environment that made it more possible for us to live the kinds of lives that we wanted to be able to live. And it's not just that individuals are vulnerable to each other, nations are vulnerable to each other. And I get just two quick examples here that are relevant to us. One is that we're vulnerable when it comes to oil, and a particularly apt example given the latest actions of OPEC. I mean, we're starting to get a little ticked off that they're not selling us enough oil. But the fact is, if they suddenly stopped selling this oil altogether, they would presumably be following Arden's principles, which is that we're wasting this valuable resource, and the appropriate thing they ought to do is to refuse to sell it. But I suspect most Americans wouldn't really like that idea very much. And as it turns out, it's not just oil. That there are a list of 13 minerals that are considered crucial for manufacturing, and we now import over 90% of 12 of those. We are dependent. We in the United States are dependent upon other people selling and trading with us, but the difference is we have money, and we have a military, and countries who are poverty-stricken have not. And so therefore they can't demand that people trade with them in the way that we can. Okay, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, so I want to get on to the next section. Well, I'm trying to move through this quickly anyway. Basically the idea here is that even though there are a lot of starvation in the world, it would not take that much from each one of us to make a substantial difference. Now, this next option, though, is different. The idea of the duty to rectify injustice. And what this view does is it rejects the common way in which the whole issue is normally framed. All right, again, the way that's normally framed is they're in need, what can we do to help them? And that assumes that we are in no way responsible for their plight. We didn't cause it or sustain it by anything that we did. But as it turns out, that's going to be one of the questions we're going to ask is whether those assumptions are true. Now, the reason this doesn't matter is if we are in some way causally responsible, if in some way we cause or brought about their poverty, then we need to assist them not because we're vulnerable, not because we offer help them, not because we're generous, but because we owe it to them as a matter of justice. Consider the following example. Suppose I'm driving down the road and you're driving down the road and I accidentally swerve my car and hit your car. The wreck is my fault. What does that require in a very long sense is that I ought to pay for the repairs on your car and any damage, any medical bills you may have, and any other costs you may have. If I cause the harm, I'll pay recompense for it. And what some people have wanted to argue, and the most prominent person to do this among the philosophical circles is the philosopher named Thomas Pogge, is that we are responsible for the plight of people who are impoverished. We are responsible for starvation in the world, at least to some degree. But to that extent, we are responsible, and we owe them a duty of justice to help them. It's not a matter of generosity. It's not a matter of just helping them, people who are in need. Okay. Now, what about the claim that we cause their plight? Okay. Which is a claim that he wants to make. Now, in one sense, the very same factors that explain why and how we are vulnerable to others goes at least part of the way to explaining why it might be true that we somewhat cause their plight. I mean, look, we are in an increasing global economy, and we push the idea of global economy. But what does it mean to have a global economy? Means that what we do, what we choose to do, what we choose to buy, what we choose not to buy, what kind of tariffs we choose to erect, what kind of aid we choose to give, all of which will influence other countries and other individuals' ability to feed themselves. Now, in fact, we do recognize this when we're the persons who are being harmed. Again, the case of OPEC is a perfect example. Right? We recognize that OPEC's positions are going to damage our economy. By increasing oil prices, we're going to increase transportation prices. If we increase transportation prices, you increase the prices of virtually every good that we purchase. We recognize that when other countries do it to us, but somehow we tend to forget it when we do it to other countries. The fact is we are in an unequal bargaining position. We have the goodies, and we take advantage of that unequal bargaining positions. For example, the tariffs that the developing country establishes are such that we put larger tariffs, 4 times as high tariffs, on the imports from developing countries that we have to do on other developed countries. So we in fact make it harder for those countries to trade with us. Not easier, we make it harder. Now, I want to say a little bit about this idea of being responsible or being having caused at least in part the poverty and starvation of the world. I mean, when I use this language, and I'm not sure if it's what Toby means, but it's what I mean, we don't have to say that we, as a country, are wholly and solely responsible for all the poverty in the world or all the poverty in the world. Thinking such a claim is overblown and not really based in fact. But I don't really think that's the issue. The issue isn't are we wholly responsible, did we totally cause it? The fact is I don't think we ever completely cause anything. I think the issue is best put, am I responsible enough? Did I play some role in bringing about the poverty and starvation in the world such that I ought to make some effort to alleviate it? Now, let me give some examples about that, which I think at least illustrate it. Now, in the 2 examples which come to me are the case of parents and their children and teachers and their students. Look, I am who I am, at least in part, because of the parents I had. They instilled in me certain kinds of values, and those values importantly shape the kind of person I am. Now, did they make me exactly the person I am? Are they responsible for every mistake I make? Of course not. On the other hand, it would be silly to deny the fact that they did make an important difference in who I am and the kind of person I am. Likewise, when we think about teachers and students. Can I teach a student who does not want to be taught? No. But that doesn't mean the other choice isn't that I don't have any role to play in the education of students. The fact is teachers do influence how students learn, whether they learn, and what they learn. What both of these cases show is that the notion of causing something or bringing something about does not have to mean that we totally produce it. It simply has to mean that we are causally responsible enough to take more responsibility for what we've done. That parents, when their kids screw up, need to think about what role might I have played in making my child the person that I made. When our students don't learn, it is important that teachers ask themselves, what could I have done differently that would have made the teaching experience more effective? It does not have to mean that I'm wholly responsible. It only has to mean that I am responsible enough. Okay? In short, we don't need to make a precise determination in order to talk about an obligation to rectify injustice. All we need to make, I think, is a claim that we played some important role in the poverty and starvation in the world. Now, one of the things that makes me want to say that we did play a role, and do continue to play a role, is that we benefit from the fact that they are impoverished. And the most obvious way that we benefit is by getting cheap products from them. And hey, I mean, if all of us as consumers, if we have a choice between buying something at twice the rate or at half the rate, we want to buy it cheaper. Okay? So we might complain about the system that we live in, but we don't complain enough to do anything about it. Because at some level, we like the fact that we benefit from the social, economic, and political system we have. So, what do I want to say? That's hoping on time. What I want to call responsibility in the real world. Look, in the real world, the United States did not make every problem that exists in the world, did not create every problem that exists in the world. But nonetheless, because of our political, social, and economic power, we did play a role in the way the world is now. And by my light, that makes us responsible enough to say that we ought to do something to help alleviate the problem. That we did partially cause their suffering. We did partially support the continuation of the suffering. We benefit from their impoverishment, and we do nothing substantial to change it. And to the extent that we do, then we ought to acknowledge our responsibility and to try to do something to help. And the fact is, we're doing just the opposite. If you look at the list of official development aid, and you look at the 24 richest countries in the world, where is the United States in this list of 24? 24. Right? In terms of our percentage of official aid in comparison to our gross national product, we are the stingiest country in the world. Most other countries in the Western world will give 2, 3, 4, 5, or even, in the case of Norway, 8 times as much as we do. And our percentage is going down. Okay, if you look at 1990, we were 22nd of 24. In the 10 years since then, we dropped. So it seems to me, rather than recognizing our responsibilities, we've in fact been running away from them. And that, I think, is more than tolerable. So, okay. You want to feel questions? Okay. Thank you. Questions? What benefits we get from the impoverishment in the world? Well, the main thing we get is cheap goods. Okay, when people are poor and the incomes they have are small, then the goods that they produce are going to be much cheaper than the goods that we produce here. So we import goods from other countries, and we get them at reduced rates because they're cheap. We also benefit because we just don't have the same sort of competition. The issue of competition, think about it in the following way. Think about it not now in terms of rich and poor, but think about it in terms of black and white. Okay? Whites benefit from the history of discrimination in this country. Why? Because of that history of discrimination, there were not as many blacks that were permitted to compete against us. Males benefited over females historically. Why? Because females weren't competing for jobs. So if you were a white male, you had fewer competitors. So we benefited from the discrimination, both racial and sexual, even if we didn't promulgate ourselves. But the same for the countries and the United States benefits. Indeed, any monopoly benefits from having a monopoly. We can take advantage of the power. For example, why is it that tariffs are so much higher against developing countries? Well, because we can extract those tariffs and they can command them from us. I'm not sure who's next. Okay, I'll just use it. Okay.
You mentioned feeding, but is there any other solutions to hunger?
No, the problem is not going to be hunger by itself. I mean, one of the things that I've been impressed with is the way in which the international community is trying to deal with the issue of hunger, and seeing it not just as an issue on its own, but tied up with obviously issues of poverty, education, infant mortality rate, and even something as simple as clean drinking water. Now, why does clean drinking water matter? What's its role in all this? Well, when you do not have clean drinking water, the incidence of diarrhea in the country increases dramatically, and diarrhea is a killer when someone is already malnourished. So when you have high incidence of diarrhea because of bad drinking water, infant mortality rates go up. Once infant mortality rates go up, you get into the cycle. Why does education matter? Well, I mean, sometimes people are trying to say education matters because we understand that we need to control the population. That's not why education matters. Or if it does, it's only a very small explanation. The primary reason that education matters, especially for women, is that it delays the beginning of childbearing. Again, I was showing Clark earlier a picture of my grandfather and grandmother who were married at 14 and 15. Okay? She started having her first kid at 15. Right? Okay, that sometimes happens today, but it was fairly common in those days. It's not as common now. It's not as common now because you have more women who are getting education through college. So they put off childbearing 23, 24, 25, 26, 30. And you simply locked off 10 to 15 years that you could have been having children. That alone is going to help control population. The other thing education is going to do, particularly for women, it's going to increase their marketability. If you increase their marketability, you have the possibility of two people working in a household. You're not going to have the same worries about being children when you're 65 or 40. So there is no simple problem. There's no magic bullet. What it's going to take is a concerted effort on the parts of countries that have wanted to exist. It's also going to take efforts on the parts of countries that are impoverished. I mean, there are going to have to be some changes in those countries. There is a certain amount of corruption, which can make it difficult for people to be fixed. So I don't think it's a simple answer, but it is clear that we can make a difference. I mean, there are any number of cases where countries have, in a relatively short period of time, gone from having a high number of people who are starving and impoverished to very low numbers that have substantially increased their lifespan. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think you started off.
You started off your talk about the problem of hunger and starvation, and as you pointed out, that's one of the problems. One thing that I would like to comment on is here I would say in agriculture, we're often told that it's important to increase food production or work in research towards increasing production and feeding the world. But in your point of view, does the world have enough food? It's always not enough money for supply of food.
I think much of the problem is the fact that you know, but it's not the only problem. Even if it